Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm here to give you part 2 of our Nestjs and Hotwire tutorial or experiment, if you will. For those of you who haven't seen video 1, I decided that I wanted to give this HTML over the wire approach a shot that's been popularized by tools such as Ruby on Rails, Phoenix Live View, or Laravel Livewire, where we're going to be delivering our UI using WebSockets or server-sent events. I decided on Hotwire because this technology is actually platform agnostic, so it's not tied to Ruby on Rails. But before I went down the path of attempting to learn an entirely new language, I thought let's implement this with the JavaScript backend so we can kick the tires and get a feel for how things are. If you notice on the first video, we kind of did a very basic setup and kept everything unstyled. But now I wanted to move forward and see what it would be like to do a bit more of a Rails type setup and see how that works. I chose to use Nestjs as the backend, and I implemented a few niceties that I think will help things out. One of the things that the new Rails 7 comes without is not a JavaScript bundler for the front end. They rely on standard module imports, which is now a thing that we can use. And so I decided, let's see what this would feel like to not have a front end bundler. So I chose to go with a small style framework. One of the ones I picked here was Tachyons. This is very, very similar to Tailwind, if you're familiar with Tailwind, except it's quite a bit smaller than Tailwind. So for a few kilobytes, you get a bunch of nice little classes, atomic CSS classes, if you will, but you don't need to do any of the post-CSS processing, which I think Tailwind gets a little bit heavy if you're not going to use it with the post-CSS processor. So went with that to give our application just a touch of style here, so it's a little easier to work with and look at. I also added Alpine.js, although for this I'm not actually using it, but for doing any kind of front-end effects, scripting, state management, where you don't want to be hitting the back end, the Hotwire docs reference stimulus framework, I decided that I wanted to give a little bit more of a shot with Alpine because it comes with a lot of batteries included for a very small package size. And I like some of the things they do, things like focus lock on modals and stuff that is somewhat painful to implement yourself. So I'd prefer to use them. And then, of course, the standard Hotwire Turbo with stream source connection that you saw from the previous video. So taking a look, you'll see that I have 3 windows open here because I think that in kicking the tires on this, one of the things that first came to my mind is the security concern of streaming updates to multiple clients. So it was really cool in the first video that anytime I typed or created a new message or edited a message, it would stream to another window or client. This is great for public facing pages that could perhaps be receiving a tweet stream or something of that nature, but not so great if we have logged in experiences. So it got me thinking, in order for me to effectively use Turbo with this backend, I would have to implement some way to ensure that we're only broadcasting these messages to the people that are supposed to get them. Ruby on Rails has this figured out for you already in their backend implementation, as does the other frameworks, Phoenix Elixir being another one by way of something called channels. But we'd have to do this ourselves. So just wanted to sidebar there that already when I'm evaluating a technology like this, and I'm thinking, would this work for my language, my framework, particularly JavaScript, something like that stands out at me as a little bit of a red flag to use on a production project or a project that I'm getting paid to build, because that type of security concern is not something that I'd like to be building on the clock, so to speak, or in project, on deadline, things like that. The other side of this is you don't know what you don't know. For a lot of these open source frameworks that are implementing these features, they go through security checks by virtue of all of their developers banging this thing around and finding issues with it. So already I would sort of keep that in the back of your mind, that if you want to use this as something for a production project, just keep in mind that I'm building a demo here. I'm going to make the code available to you, but this is something that you'll want to double and triple check on. So I just want to give a little example here. For example, let me just create a new message here, and let's just refresh all these pages here so we can start with some fresh. We could see that new message is already there. If I edit the message, let's say I misspelled it, update, it streams to all three. Now I have two clients here that are in my public window, and I have one that is in an incognito window. Now let's just do a second message here. You can see it streamed to my window, but it did not stream to the next window. And I have a messages counter that I added, nothing streamed here, but if I refresh the page, it comes together. So without having built login here, I was looking at the idea that I'm building an application. The vast majority of applications that we're going to build are going to want to just update in the client or browser that is using them. Real-time applications are a special use case. The vast majority of applications I've built in my career have not required any kind of real-time functionality at all. So the first step is, how do I use this without broadcasting things to everybody? So the way that I went about this, and that I think that other frameworks go about this, is I used cookies. Let's just jump over to our app controller here and take a look at our TurboStream, our events SSE, server sent event here. And what's happening is, if there's no cookie set, I am setting a unique ID to the person who sets up the stream, basically saying, hey, this is your stream ID, and anything that needs to happen, I'm creating this broadcast to variable that can look at three situations that I could see coming up all the time. One of them is self, which you're looking at right now, which is I want to only broadcast any streaming to me. All, which is the use case that we had before, which is this is public, send this to everybody that's connected no matter what. And then there's this with permissions case, which I could see requiring something of a predicate function. Hey, this should go to, if 2 users or 4 users are in a chat room, and it should go to all users in the chat if you're building a chat app. That would be a use case for with permissions. Not implementing that today, but I kind of put the boilerplate together for what I'd like to see happen there. And then we have this situation of a switch case going over the broadcast to variable, which is the all case, which is just send the template over to everybody. The other one is only send this if the stream ID matches the cookie. So for every time one of these is set up, if they don't match, as my 2 standard browser windows already have the same cookie, so they're both catching the stream, whereas the private window acts as a different client, they're not catching the stream and they're not receiving that. And then of course the with permissions case, little to do if you want to go about that. Didn't need to do that to get a feel here. We can go over to our app service where we have our send TurboStream event, which is going to emit the event with the request stream ID. So if you take a look, when we're going to emit the event, and I'll jump over to the messages controller, because one of the things I did for this demo is I set this up a little bit more the way that Nestjs would want you to set it up, and a little bit more a la Ruby on Rails or like an MVC framework, where we would break out our services and controllers. I implemented Prisma as an ORM so that it's actually saving these messages to a SQLite database. If we could kind of take a look here at our controller, you can see that I have the send TurboStream event broadcasting to all when there's a new message here. When we edit a message, but I have it broadcasting to self when we create a message. So you just saw the create message scenario where it is broadcasting to self, and the other scenario where it is broadcasting to all. So you may be asking yourself, if you know a little bit how turbo frames work, well, why not just return a new turbo frame? If we want to do self or broadcasting only to ourselves, why not just return the turbo frame with the update and forget turbo streams? That is a viable alternative, except when you're trying to update other components on the page. So you can use a directive in your turbo frame for the target to be what's called _top, which will basically refetch the whole page on that update, which would effectively do this, except if you were building some kind of a dashboard where maybe you have 6 or 7 different modules on the page and a few of them need to update but not all of them. You're basically making this heavy data fetch every single time. So you really do want the power of turbo streams. Another use case that's very simple is I add a product to cart on a PDP page, but I want to update a little cart counter in the top right, or a little cart drawer in the top of my app. Turbo streams is the way to do that, because if we take a look at our turbo streams in our views here, let's take a look at creating a message. You can actually make multiple page updates. I can send a whole bunch of these over. So for instance, I'm appending the new message to the message UL. I'm also updating our messages count. So I can say like update messages count. I can send multiple updates to the page, and Turbo can actually update these little pieces as though we're updating components in another framework, which is pretty nice. You do notice, when I first did that first create with no messages on the page, though the message didn't show up till I refreshed. There is a little bit of I find a little bit cumbersome in the sense that I wanted to update this UL, but I didn't put the UL in my HTML, so therefore the LI didn't pop in. I could very easily, in my empty state, kind of add that in there where it's hey, there's no messages, so I can show you the messages. Here, see, I have no messages yet. Really, I needed to add this as a slot. So the thing that I would say, if you're coming from Nestjs like I am, or the React world, one of the things you have to kind of get used to with using this framework is you have a little bit of that manual DOM update kind of feel. It's a little less declarative than you might be used to if you're coming from React, where the data mutates and React updates the DOM almost as a side effect of your data updating. It's a different representation. Here, you have to go about it with the whole idea of like, I'm going to append this to this DOM element. So it's important to think about that paradigm. That being said, I don't think this is a terrible thing at all. I didn't mind it. I love the idea of just saying, hey, for creating a message, these are all the streams. This is all the types of updates that I need to happen on a UI when this occurs. I think that's kind of straightforward. So there's advantages to this, but I also think that the paradigm does require a little bit of a mental shift for you. So as you can see, let's jump back over into here. The edit is broadcasting to all. So as you saw before, I'm able to update this and all 3 clients catch the update. If I delete, all 3 clients catch the delete. If I add, though, a new message, only these 2 clients self gets it. And you could see how once we add login and with permissions, you'll use that with permissions predicate, and we can add some logic around this. Now, why didn't I go about, if some of you know Turbo and are familiar with it, the idea of using a single event source in the head actually goes against the documentation. They have this idea of a Turbo, I think it's like a stream source element with an SRC, and you can actually connect to multiple stream sources like /messages /ID. And if you had like an ID in there from your page, you could use that. And you could actually connect to multiples of these. And I think in effect, the idea there is to leverage the security of the domain model to enforce itself. So you don't have to create that stream piece the problem that I ran into when I did that is I created a few models. I created a messages model and a message. If you have a bunch of frames on the page and they share across pages, and then you start navigating from home to about, what I noticed is things started to lock up, and it actually like froze up the app in a weird way because the streams or the server sent events were trying to connect and disconnect, and it wasn't effectively happening. Upon a little bit more research, it seems that Rails had experienced this problem and had solved for it, or was working on a solve for it when this happens. But it seemed like it was a common problem that was being addressed by the framework. The other thing that I thought about was it seems a little bit inefficient to potentially, again, if I'm building a dashboard and I have a bunch of data, it seems a little bit inefficient to have every client load up like 6 server sent events or 4 or even 2. It kind of it feels like it would magnify the amount of memory we would need, even though server set events are more efficient than WebSockets. It just gave me a little bit of unease to do it that way. It felt a little bit more like needing all those connections to manage this versus broadcasting it over a single connection that persisted across page loads. Felt a little bit more efficient. It felt a little bit more like the way I would prefer this if it were me doing the implementation, which it is. So that being said, what's the performance like on this? Well, I haven't dug that far into it, but it is something that I think about when I'm looking at an application like this. I'm looking at, okay, now I have one connection per user, and if I'm using, again, server sent events, much more performant than a WebSocketed approach when it comes to the node style, as far as my research has shown. But also, you don't know until you don't know, right? You don't know until you know. It's one of those things that's a little bit of an unknown for me as to how this would scale to lots of users versus the standard client-side applications that we're used to, a la Nestjs, especially when you look at something like Nestjs with React server components, which is what we've been exploring on our end, what the industry is moving towards. So, final conclusion here is that, do I feel that this paradigm is going to feel a whole lot more efficient than one of the JavaScript meta frameworks, whether that be SvelteKit, whether that be Next.js, whether that be Nuxt? I don't think so. I think that in general, you'd probably, there's a little bit of unknowns, so to speak, around the performance. I think that also having to implement the socketed approach, the security around this, I would want a little bit more time with it before I rolled this out in production. I don't think it's ready to go right now. It's something I'd have to play with. However, as I was talking about, I do think this approach could be really effective. If you were in the Ruby ecosystem, if you were in the PHP ecosystem, that was your language of choice, I think this is a really effective way to avoid having to learn the complexities of modern front-end development. The reality is I'm very familiar with React, and a lot of the people I work with are very familiar with React, so we're comfortable with it. But if I were coming from, if I'm used to writing Ruby on Rails, if I'm used to writing PHP, if I'm used to writing Elixir, it is easier to stay in one language. This is why I think JavaScript developers have embraced the idea of isomorphism, why we build a lot of backends in JavaScript or TypeScript. We like the idea of one language across backend and frontend, and Hotwire can get you there. I think Hotwire would work really well in a language like Go that can handle lots of WebSocket connections really well. I think that if you're coming from a language that doesn't have its way to handle front end, this is also a really great implementation that you should explore, that's going to avoid you needing to package in a bunch of node bundlers and things of that nature. That's always been something that used to bother me, even when I used Ruby on Rails with Webpacker, and you'd have to have this node server running and building everything, and it kind of just felt like a lot. And I think that this shows me, hey, you can actually write a bunch of front end, write your front end in just plain JS with just standard module imports and not have to worry so much about anything else. And somebody did ask me that in a question about the first article, what about Turbo not using TypeScript? Well, as you can see, you really don't write a ton of front end or client side JavaScript. Most of your scripting is going to happen in the back, and most of your programming happens on the back end with this. So it didn't bother me that there was no TypeScript on the front end for this. In fact, I would probably try to avoid using a bundler as long as I possibly could, especially if I was in the Rails world today. I kind of like this idea that maybe I don't need all that weight. But again, to each their own. A lot of people, kind of like some of these tools, especially if you're going to use Tailwind. I do think you'll want to use that with Post CSS. The other thing that I didn't love, I wasn't a huge fan. Like I went with the handlebars things. I definitely would prefer JSX over handlebars as a template engine. So kind of going down, or TSX in this case, I think that would have made it nicer. Something that just allowed me to kind of work with the partials and all that stuff a little bit better. Things that I would have liked to use. And then my last thought on this is when I think about building applications this way, and when I kind of went into this, my thought was I want to do this in JavaScript first to see if it's worth my time learning this paradigm in the future. And when I think about lots of socketed connections, doing all my updates from the back end, really having these server-driven apps, I think the Beam engine, Elixir, Phoenix, this is poised for this use case. So if you are not, if you do not already know, Ruby, and if you do not already know PHP, and you have to learn a new language anyway to get the real advantage, you're going to build something production with this paradigm. I think that it would be worth your while to stick with the Elixir ecosystem. The Beam virtual machine is poised to handle these lots and lots of processes, lots of client connections. You could scale to a few thousand users. I don't know what this would look like scaling to just a few thousand users, let's say. Nothing crazy. But with Elixir, I think it's got really great error handling and fail safes. They've handled all the security around working with channels and streams, which again, I don't know what I'm missing here. This is something I'd have to kick around with and really think about before I felt like comfortable building a production application with this that was going to share user data, right? But with something like Elixir and Phoenix, they've already thought through all of those issues, and the back end is really poised to handle lots and lots of connections like this and not blow up on you. So that's my take is I think that what this has shown me is, hey, I'll probably kick around with this for fun for a little bit more, because I did have fun building this, and I'm kind of exploring how far this would go. Could I replace handlebars with a bit of a better template engine here and get some better ergonomics around this? But I'm also thinking to myself, maybe it's worthwhile to learn Phoenix and get in on the live view hype, because I think that the hype is probably worth it, and it can save you a lot of complexity. Modern front-end development is admittedly pretty complex, and it can be pretty fatiguing if you've been in it a while. Even now, we're going through yet another kind of shift. React server components are very much taking to this paradigm with actions in Nestjs, and you may be looking at that and going, this feels a little bit like the joke goes, this feels like PHP. Yes, in a lot of ways it does. I think that this should show you that the industry is sort of coming around to the idea that there is a lot of advantages to doing the rendering on the server. And I think that that Phoenix ecosystem and the Phoenix team have put a lot of work into making Live View what it is today. So that's the final verdict for me, is if you are a JavaScript developer, a TypeScript developer, and you want the best developer experience out there, I still think you're going to get that with the meta frameworks. But if you have played around with this now, or you can load this up and try it yourself, and you're thinking, you know what, this HTML over the wire approach feels like it would be really cool, really efficient, I would recommend checking out Phoenix, because I think you could get that going on a production application right away. The security has been handled for you. It can handle channels and chats and all sorts of scale. The Beam virtual machine is awesome, and I think that it's poised for this use case specifically. Hope you guys enjoyed. Again, I'll post the Git repo to the channel here, so you guys can take a look and kick the tires some more, and I'll let you know how things go.